The night Rosalind Hartley was named before 140 witnesses, she was already standing near the door. She had positioned herself there deliberately, as she had learned to do at every gathering where she was present by necessity rather than invitation, close enough to fetch whatever Lady Cecilia required, far enough from the candlelight that her plain dove-gray gown would not invite comparison to the satins and pearls assembled at the dinner table. She had been standing in that calculated margin for 3 seasons now, and she had become very good at it. The art of occupying a room without claiming any portion of it. She did not expect the evening to end differently from any other. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a clergyman who had died leaving £4,000 in unresolved debt, and a mother whose nerves had not recovered from the discovery of it. She had no portion, no prospects, and no patron except Lady Cecilia Vane, who kept her in the household as companion to her mother, providing room and board in exchange for the kind of steady, invisible service that required intelligence to perform and forbade its acknowledgement. Rosalind performed it. She kept her observations behind her teeth and her reactions behind her eyes, and she had grown so practiced at the discipline that some evenings she wondered if she had misplaced herself somewhere along the corridor between her small room and the drawing-room, and arrived at the dinner table as nothing more than a function. It was not a comfortable thought. She did not permit it to stay long. She had first come to Ashmore House in October, when Lady Cecilia had written to her mother with the offer. Her mother, Gwen Hartley, had wept with relief. £4,000 was not an abstraction to either of them. It was the specific number attached to her father's name in Mr. Phineas Dowell's ledger, and it had the quality of a stone tied at the ankle. Rosalind had read the solicitor's letter herself, twice, noting the interest calculation, and then she had folded it precisely and placed it in the drawer where her father had kept his correspondence, and she had gone to pack her trunk for London. Lady Cecilia's household ran on a particular logic. There were the guests who mattered, and there were the people who maintained the conditions under which guests could matter. Rosalind understood with perfect clarity which category she occupied. The drawing-room at Ashmore House was decorated in cream and gold, hung with portraits of ancestors whose expressions suggested they had never once questioned their right to be painted, and Lady Cecilia received there every Tuesday morning with the precision of a military operation. Her jewels were always the same, a set of garnets at her throat that caught the light when she turned her head in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Her fan was always ivory. Her chosen candidate for the season, Miss Arabella Fitch, sat always at her right hand, luminous in white muslin, and very aware of it. On the 3rd Tuesday in November, Lady Cecilia said, without looking up from the letter she was reading, that it was a shame some young women were obliged to attend society functions they had no business attending, where their presence could only encourage speculation about motives better left unexamined. She said it to the room, which held 4 other callers, all of whom understood precisely who was meant. Rosalind, standing at the small table where the tea things were arranged, heard every word. She poured the tea. She did not spill a drop. That was the first time. The season's great ball at Ashmore House fell on the 14th of November, and it was among the most attended events of the year. Lady Cecilia had organized it with characteristic authority, the guest list running to 140 names, the ballroom lit with 3 chandeliers whose candles she had inspected personally that afternoon. Rosalind had spent the day helping with the flower arrangements, carrying stems of hothouse roses up 2 flights of stairs and receiving no acknowledgement for having done so, and by the time the guests arrived, she was stationed in her habitual position, the margin of things, presentable and invisible. She was watching the room rather than the dancing when she became aware that Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, was standing approximately 4 feet to her left. She had seen him before, of course. He was impossible not to see. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that dark formal dress only made more apparent, and he had a face that appeared to have been constructed with the specific intent of conveying that requests for warmth would not be entertained. His jaw had the quality of something carved rather than grown. His eyes were the gray of old pewter, steady and cool, and they moved across a room with the particular efficiency of a man who had long since stopped being impressed by what rooms contained. He was standing still while the ball moved around him. And Rosalind thought, with the wry private clarity she permitted herself in margins, that he looked rather like a pier in a harbor, unmoved and useful, and not at all concerned with the sea. She did not speak. She had no occasion to speak to him. He was the master of the house, and she was the companion's daughter serving as companion, and the distance between those two positions was not one the season permitted to be bridged by conversation. He glanced at her. It was a brief thing. The kind of glance that might have meant nothing. The kind of attention one gives a particular arrangement of flowers to confirm they are still where they were placed. Rosalind catalogued it and filed it under nothing, because that was the honest category. He looked away. She looked away. The orchestra played on. She did not see him watch her for the next 40 minutes. The audience did. He stood at the edge of the room 3 separate times in the course of that evening, and each time the angle of his stillness shifted almost imperceptibly toward her, as though adjusted by a current she could not feel. When she moved, he did not follow. He simply became slightly more still. She noticed none of it. The first occasion on which Rosalind did something that cost her was not at the ball. It came 10 days later, in the schoolroom at the top of the house, where Edmund's ward, a boy of 9 years named Thomas, was receiving his morning lesson. Thomas was a quiet child with a habit of watching adults the way small creatures watch larger ones, with attention and without expectation of tenderness. His tutor, a Mr. Grady, who had been engaged for the season and appeared to believe that volume was a form of instruction, had that morning told Thomas that his translation of a Latin passage was not merely incorrect, but reflected a want of intelligence that bordered on the shameful. He had said this loudly, with the confidence of a man accustomed to performing his authority rather than exercising it. Rosalind had been sent to the schoolroom to deliver a note from Lady Cecilia regarding Thomas's afternoon schedule. She had arrived in the doorway as Mr. Grady delivered his verdict. Thomas sat very still, his hands flat on the tabletop, his face composed in the particular way of children who have learned that showing distress only invites more of what caused it. Rosalind looked at the passage on the slate. She looked at Thomas. She looked at Mr. Grady. She said quietly and precisely that the boy's translation was not incorrect. It was the less common rendering used by Cicero in the 3rd letter of the 1st book, and it reflected a careful reading rather than a careless one. She said this without raising her voice, without ornamentation, and without looking away from Mr. Grady's reddening face. Mr. Grady said something about women and schoolrooms and the proper division of competence between them. Rosalind placed the note from Lady Cecilia on the table, said that the Duke would no doubt wish to be informed that his ward was progressing well, and left the doorway. She did not know that Edmund had been standing in the corridor behind her, having arrived at the schoolroom a full 2 minutes before she had, for reasons he had not examined carefully. She did not hear him follow her departure with his eyes. She did not see the way his expression, which had been closed and cool as always, shifted for just a moment into something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. He dismissed Mr. Grady 3 days later, citing an incompatibility of methods, and said nothing to Rosalind about it. Thomas, who had been watching all of this with the specific attention of a child who understands more than adults suppose, began leaving small objects outside Rosalind's door. A smooth stone, a pressed leaf, a drawing of a horse, which was recognizably a horse if one was generous. She kept all of them. It was in the second week of December that Edmund found her in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, reading aloud to Thomas. She had not known he was there. The boy had come to her door that afternoon with a book and an expression of studied nonchalance that had moved her more than she allowed her face to show, and she had sat with him on the window seat and read from it. A Natural History of Birds, which Thomas found amusing, and which Rosalind found herself genuinely absorbed by, pausing to comment on the illustrations with more enthusiasm than she usually permitted herself in the presence of the household. She used her full voice. She did not modulate it for an audience. She read a passage about the common swift and told Thomas that she thought a creature which spent its entire life in the air and only touched the ground to nest was either the freest animal in nature or the loneliest, and she was not sure the difference mattered to the swift. Thomas considered this seriously and said he thought it mattered quite a lot, actually. Rosalind laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and brief, and it transformed her face in a way that the drawing-room version of her face never did. Opened it. Made it legible. Edmund stood in the doorway for another full minute before he moved away. Something had shifted in him, though he would not have named it as such. He was a man who had learned not to name things prematurely. There had been a woman once, his wife Caroline, who had been bright in rooms the way Rosalind was bright in that window seat, and he had not been careful enough, or present enough, or whatever it was that might have saved her from the fever that took her in the 3rd year of their marriage. That was what he believed, at any rate. The physicians had said there was nothing to be done. He had not found that convincing. He had a portrait of Caroline in the upstairs gallery, and he had passed it every morning for 4 years without altering the fact of it. The grief had become structural, the way a repaired bone sometimes remains thicker at the break, and he had organized his life around it with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. He would not cause that damage again. He had been very resolved about it. He was somewhat less resolved than he had been. Lady Cecilia saw this the way she saw most things. First, accurately, and then with the calculation of someone whose entire social architecture depended on a particular outcome. Arabella Fitch was the correct choice. Her family was old, her manner was polished, her conversation was the kind that required nothing inconvenient of the listener. She did not laugh unguarded in window seats, and she did not correct tutors in corridors, and she was, in Lady Cecilia's assessment, exactly what a duke required. Rosalind Hartley was the daughter of a clergyman with £4,000 of unresolved debt, and she was becoming a problem. At the dinner, Lady Cecilia hosted on the 19th of December, with 36 guests and the full arrangement of candles and garnet jewels, and Arabella seated at the position of maximum advantage. Lady Cecilia said across the table, during a pause in conversation that she had perhaps engineered, that it was a pity when young women of uncertain means allowed themselves to form attachments to establishments above their station. She said that such women should be pitied rather than condemned, because their position made the temptation understandable, even if the conduct itself was not. She said the word fortune hunter with the precision of a woman who had chosen it carefully and placed it where the acoustics were best. The table heard it. Rosalind heard it from her position 3 places to the left, where she had been arranging a supplementary dish that had been brought up late from the kitchen, having been asked to see to it rather than to sit. She kept her hands level. She met no one's eyes. She had heard herself named a fortune hunter before, in other rooms, in other years, always at the edge of earshot. She had learned to absorb the label without letting it show in her face. She was good at that. That was the third time. Later that night, alone in her small room with its single candle and its view of the kitchen garden, she sat on the edge of her bed and was honest with herself in the way she was only ever honest when no one could observe it. She had not sought anything from Edmund. She had not sought proximity. She had not angled or arranged or permitted herself to hope in any direction she could identify. She had read to a child in a window seat because the child had asked her to, and the book was interesting, and she had felt for 40 minutes as though she were herself rather than a function. And if that was conduct requiring condemnation, then the condemnation said more about the room than about her. She also knew that Lady Cecilia's assessment of the situation contained one accurate component. Rosalind's presence in the household was now a complication, and complications in households like this one were resolved through removal. She could feel the mechanism engaging. She thought about her mother, settled in the small room Lady Cecilia had allocated her, her nerves quieter than they had been in years. The £4,000 no longer discussed in the specific way that items become undiscussable when they are too frightening to name. She thought about what it would cost her mother to leave. She made her decision with the same quiet that characterized everything she did. She would not make it harder for Edmund than it needed to be. She would find an occasion to speak to Lady Cecilia directly, offer the suggestion that the arrangement had perhaps run its natural course, and depart with as much dignity as a woman in her position could carry out of a door. She would not force his hand. She would not allow herself to become leverage. This is the kind of courage that is rarely witnessed, because it does not announce itself. If you find yourself wanting to pause here and consider what it costs a person to protect someone else's freedom at the expense of their own, that impulse is the right one. We will not linger on it long. She wrote nothing that evening. She simply sat with the candle until it burned low, and then she went to sleep. What she did not know was that Edmund had spent the afternoon of that same day in a private meeting with Mr. Phineas Dowell. The solicitor had come to the side entrance of Ashmore House with his leather case and his careful expression and the record of a £4,000 debt attached to the name of the late Reverend Hartley, and he had departed an hour later with the debt discharged, the papers signed, and a receipt made out to no one in particular, because Edmund had specified that the settlement was to be handled without notification to the family until he determined the appropriate moment. Dowell had noted this instruction in his ledger, with the particular blankness of a man who understood that some requests from dukes were not invitations for commentary, and he had gone. The lever was gone. Lady Cecilia did not yet know this. Edmund had not been certain, as he signed the papers, what exactly he was doing. He had told himself it was a matter of conscience. The debt had been incurred partly through the failure of a lease arrangement that his own estate had mismanaged 2 years before Reverend Hartley's death, and it was therefore a correction rather than a gift. This was true as far as it went. He had chosen not to examine how far it went. The morning after Lady Cecilia's dinner, he rose before 6 and walked the length of the upper gallery. He stopped in front of Caroline's portrait. She had been painted in blue, which had been her preference, and the painter had captured something around her eyes that Edmund recognized as the expression she wore when she was trying not to laugh at something she had decided was her own private joke. He had always loved that expression. He had spent 4 years believing he had not deserved it. He stood in front of the portrait for a long time. He did not turn it to face the wall that morning. He was not ready for that yet. He simply looked at it until he understood what the looking had cost him and what it had purchased, and then he walked away. The night of the Christmas assembly at Drayton Hall was the 22nd of December. Lady Cecilia had organized the household's attendance with her usual precision. The carriages were ordered for 8 o'clock. Arabella arrived to dress with Lady Cecilia's own maid at her disposal, and Rosalind was invited to attend in her capacity as companion, which meant she was present but not expected to dance or to be introduced to anyone who would remember the introduction afterward. She wore her gray gown. She had repressed the neckline lace the month before when the original had frayed, using a piece she had salvaged from a dress of her mother's, and the result was neat and plain and entirely without vanity, which was both its virtue and its sentence. The hall at Drayton was lit with 4 chandeliers and a series of sconces along the north wall that gave the room the quality of late afternoon extended artificially into evening. There were, by Rosalind's estimate, upward of 100 guests in attendance when the Ashmore party arrived, and the room had the specific energy of an occasion that believed itself important and was not entirely wrong. She found her position at the edge of the south wall, near a window that gave onto the garden, cold and dark outside, the glass just beginning to show the faint trace of frost at its corners. Arabella danced the first 2 sets with men Lady Cecilia had approved, and she danced them beautifully, because she was beautiful and accomplished and entirely aware of both. Edmund stood at the far side of the room and did not dance, and was spoken to by several people whose names Rosalind did not know, and he responded in the way he always responded, briefly, without discouragement, without engagement. He looked across the room. She was standing by the frosted window, with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes on the floor beyond the dancing, and she had the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had decided was not worth the cost of showing, which was an expression he had studied across a dozen rooms by now and could identify in poor light. She looked, he thought, like someone who had made a decision that did not belong to her and was absorbing it with the same composed accuracy she brought to everything else. He understood, with the specific clarity that arrives when a thing one has been resisting finally stops being resistible, that he was not going to stand on the other side of the room from her for the rest of the evening. He moved. He crossed the floor with the directness that was his natural register in motion, the crowd parting without quite being asked to, the way crowds part for men who have never learned to navigate around the expectation that they will pass straight through. Lady Cecilia, standing with Arabella near the center of the room, saw him go. Something shifted in her expression, a single short clause of recognition that she suppressed immediately. Rosalind saw his approach when he was 8 feet away. She straightened. Her breath came in once and held. She had time to think. With the part of her mind that always maintained its ironic commentary on her own condition, that whatever he wanted, she would handle it competently and without giving anything away, because that was what she did, and she was good at it. He stopped in front of her. He said, without preamble, that he had been informed she intended to leave the household at the end of the month. She said that she had been considering it. Yes. He said that he had also been informed this morning by Mr. Dowell that the debt attached to her father's name had been discharged in full, which removed the matter from the category of considerations she was obliged to weigh. She looked at him. She said, carefully, that she was not certain what that was meant to resolve. He said, and his voice was level and precise in the way that was his register, the kind of voice that derived its authority from the fact that it never required volume, that it was meant to resolve the question of whether she had any obligation to leave. She did not. He had ensured it. What she chose to do with that freedom was her own decision entirely, and he would not pretend otherwise. The room had not yet noticed them specifically. It was still noticing generally, the way rooms do when a duke crosses a floor without apparent destination and arrives at a particular woman's position near a frosted window, which is the kind of movement that tends to produce interest among 100 guests, whether or not they are trying to produce it. He said, then, and his voice dropped into a register that was not quieter, but somehow more specific, that he would like her to stay. He said that Thomas had, in the past 3 months, become someone recognizably different from the child who had arrived at the start of the season, and that the difference was not attributable to the curriculum Mr. Grady had been dismissed for failing to deliver. He said that he had stood in the doorway of the sitting room in December and heard her tell a 9-year-old boy that the difference between freedom and loneliness might not matter to a Swift, and he had spent a considerable number of days attempting to convince himself that this observation was not important and that he had not been successful. He said, "I am asking you to stay, Miss Hartley. I am asking it as myself, not as the master of this house." The room heard that. It was not a loud sentence. It carried anyway. Arabella, who had been watching from the center of the room with the polished composure of someone who had been prepared for this season the way one prepares a thoroughbred for a specific race, understood in that moment that she had not been entered in the race she had been told she was running. Something in her face stilled, and then she looked away. And the look said, to anyone attending to it, that she was a young woman whose script had simply run out of lines. Lady Cecilia said nothing for a long moment. She had built the architecture of this season on a particular premise, and the premise had just been publicly set aside by the man whose agreement she had never thought to require, because dukes did not, in her experience, require to be asked. They were managed. Edmund had never managed gracefully, but he had managed consistently, and she had relied on that consistency with the confidence of a woman whose methods had worked everywhere, except, apparently, here. She looked at Rosalind. She looked at the room. She looked at Edmund's expression, which was not a declaration or a performance, which was simply his face doing the thing it did when he had made a decision he did not intend to revisit. Rosalind had not answered. She stood in front of him with the frost gathering on the window glass behind her and looked at a man who had just spoken her name in a room of 100 people, not as a problem to be solved, not as a footnote, not as a function, but as himself. She felt the specific, quiet vertigo of being seen by someone who had not been given permission to see and had done it anyway. She said, "I should like to stay." It was not a long answer. It was the only honest one. The room breathed again. The crowd's attention, which had been suspended in the particular, held silence that follows an unexpected public declaration, released itself in the way that collective attention does when it recognizes it has witnessed something it will describe for years. Lady Cecilia closed her fan. She stood for another moment, and whatever calculation she had been running in the private machinery of her expression arrived at its result, and the result was recognition rather than defiance. She was a woman of great intelligence and great confidence, and she had been confidently wrong about a specific thing, and she was old enough and sharp enough to know the feeling when it arrived. She inclined her head, once, in Rosalind's direction, with the minimal ceremony of someone who has just revised a fundamental assumption and has not yet decided how to rebuild around it. It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. It was something more useful. Acknowledgement. She was a hierarchy protector corrected, and she accepted the correction with the same precision she brought to everything else. Edmund offered Rosalind his arm. She took it. They crossed the room together. And the crowd did what crowds do when the Duke of Ashmore crosses a floor with a woman on his arm and a look on his face that has not been there before. They made way, and they watched, and they began revising their opinions in the direction that power had indicated was correct. There was a great deal of that kind of revision over the following weeks. In the days that followed, Mr. Dowell came again to Ashmore House and confirmed, this time in Rosalind's presence, that the debt was fully and finally discharged. Her mother, Gwen Hartley, sat in the good chair by the drawing-room fire and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, and said nothing comprehensible for several minutes, and then said, in a steadier voice, that her husband would have been very glad. Rosalind sat beside her and held her hand, and said that she believed he would have been. Thomas produced, the morning after the assembly at Drayton Hall, a drawing of 2 birds in flight. He slid it under Rosalind's door, and was 3 corridors away before she opened it. But she recognized the specific artlessness of the line, and she understood what it was meant to say. And she kept it with the stone, and the pressed leaf, and the horse. Edmund did not make speeches. He was not a man who made speeches. He spoke in questions asked at breakfast about what she had been reading, in requests that she join him and Thomas in the library on afternoons when the weather was poor, in the specific quality of attention he paid when she said something he found interesting, which was different from the attention he paid when he was merely being polite, and which she was learning, with some care, to distinguish. He told her about Caroline one evening in January, in the library, when the fire was low, and the snow outside the long windows had been falling since afternoon. He told her without theatrics. In the same level declarative way he said most things. He said that his wife had been young, and had been ill, and had died, and that he had not been able to prevent it, despite having believed for 4 years that something he did or failed to do had made that true. He said that he had come to understand, recently and somewhat against his will, that some griefs are not instructions. They are simply griefs. Rosalind listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said that she thought he had been carrying a weight that was not distributed fairly, and that she was sorry for it. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had identified once before as occupying the territory adjacent to a smile. He said that he had been told it was inadvisable to ask a woman her thoughts at length. She said that she had been told to smile and stay silent, and had found the instruction wanting in every particular. He said, "I know. I am glad the instruction failed." The snow continued. The fire was fed. Thomas had fallen asleep on the library sofa, with a book still open on his chest. And the house had the quality it had when nothing was required of it except to be itself, warm and full and quiet. On the morning that Rosalind passed the upper gallery and saw that Caroline's portrait had been gently turned to face the wall, she understood that it had not been forgotten. It had been honored, and then released, the way things are released when they have been truly held rather than avoided. She did not comment on it. She was learning that some things are said most clearly without words, and that a man who had gone 4 years without releasing a grief would manage the ceremony of it in his own register. She continued down the corridor and went to find Thomas, who had requested her opinion on whether swifts could be successfully kept in a very large and very well-provisioned mews, and whose logic on the matter deserved a serious answer. By the following spring, she had become a fixed point in the house, the way objects become fixed in rooms where they have been placed with intention. Her mother was settled in the East Wing with more light than she had known in years. Thomas had acquired a new tutor, recommended by Rosalind, who taught Latin by means of dialogue, and believed that the point of education was to produce someone worth listening to. Arabella Fitch was engaged by midsummer to a viscount whose tastes and temperament suited her considerably better than Edmund's ever would have, and Lady Cecilia attended the announcement with the expression of a woman who has successfully applied her considerable abilities to a second plan. The evening of Rosalind's wedding to Edmund was a quiet one, with snow still on the ground from an early fall and a fire in the great hearth of the main hall that had been burning since morning. The guests were few. The ceremony was short. Edmund said the words in the same level voice he used for everything he meant, which is to say clearly, without ornament. And only once. Afterward, she sat at the piano in the library and played without particular purpose, working through pieces she half remembered, stopping in the middle of phrases and starting again, because there was no audience and no requirement, and she could. Thomas fell asleep again in the same chair as before, which was becoming a habit. Her mother watched the snow at the window with the quiet of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had arrived somewhere safe enough to stop. Edmund sat in the chair nearest the fire and said nothing for a long time, and then said, without looking up from the book he was not really reading, that she had left the Clementi unfinished. She said she knew. She said she had decided the ending was negotiable. He looked up then, and that expression was there again. The one that was not quite a smile, but had become, over the course of a winter, something she could read without effort. Warm, specific, aimed directly at her. The snow fell against the long windows. The candle on the piano had burned low and steady. Outside, the garden was white and still, and entirely unconcerned with the season's verdicts. She was home. If Rosalind's quiet courage moved you this evening, leave a word about it in the comments. Stories like hers remind us that being truly seen is worth every page of the wait.